Imagine waking up on a Tuesday morning. You walk to your local bank, ask to withdraw your life savings, and the teller looks you in the eye and tells you every single dollar you've ever earned is entirely gone. That was the reality on October 29, 1929. Outside the New York Stock Exchange, a localized panic physically manifested as a flood of bodies. Thousands of terrified citizens choked the narrow concrete canyons of the financial district, trapping themselves in a crushing, desperate gridlock. Inside the exchange, the floor was drowning in discarded order slips. Traders were violently liquidating millions of shares, shouting over one another as fortunes evaporated second by second, leaving only worthless papers scattered beneath their feet. As the morning stretched into the afternoon, disbelief hardened into a quiet, existential dread. There were no institutional rescues, no wealthy bankers stepping in to buy the dip. The safety nets they relied on had completely dissolved. By the closing bell, the American industrial machine, the engine that had driven a decade of unchecked prosperity, ground to an absolute halt. The capital that fueled factories, payrolls, and national expansion vanished into thin air. A nation at the peak of its wealth bankrupted itself in a single afternoon. We have to ask how a localized panic on a single street in Manhattan ignited a chain reaction that plunged the entire global economy into a dark age. The baseline for this collapse was set in the decade prior. The 1920s delivered a period of explosive economic growth. Wages rose, factories scaled up, and vertical expansion reshaped city skylines. The public was convinced this upward trajectory was a mathematical certainty. Ordinary citizens stopped putting their wages into traditional savings accounts. Instead, they began gambling on the stock market, using a mechanism called margin trading, the practice of buying shares with borrowed money. The mathematics of margin were highly unbalanced. An investor could purchase stock by putting down as little as 10 cents on the dollar in cash. The remaining 90% was loaned by a broker, creating a massive structure of debt balanced on a tiny sliver of actual capital. This highly leveraged system rapidly multiplies wealth, but it operates under one strict, unforgiving condition: the market must perpetually rise. If prices fall, the debt remains, but the asset paying for it vanishes. Tracking these stock prices became a national obsession. Look at the intense focus on these men's faces as a worker manually updates a chalkboard. Wall Street was no longer a financial utility for businesses to raise capital. It operated as a societal casino. The immense wealth generated during the Roaring Twenties was a phantom. It was a paper illusion, heavily dependent on a psychological high-wire act, requiring that the public never ask to cash out their chips all at once. In late October, that illusion shattered. The market dipped, breaking the expectation of endless growth. This drop triggered the first wave of margin calls, demands from brokers requiring investors to immediately deposit cash to cover their loans. Most investors didn't have the cash. This initiated a brutal cycle of forced selling. Brokers began liquidating their clients' shares at any available price to recover the loaned money. Those fire sales drove the market price down further, triggering even more margin calls. The panic was accelerated by a critical technological failure. This is a ticker tape machine, the device used to transmit stock prices across the country. Overwhelmed by the sheer volume of trades, the mechanical systems fell hours behind real-time pricing. Because the tape lagged, investors across America were trading completely blind. They had no way of knowing what their shares were actually worth, and as the losses mounted, they sold their positions out of terror. By Black Tuesday, October 29th, the last remaining pillars of institutional support withdrew from the market. Investment banks stopped buying. The floor of the exchange gave way, leaving asset prices in a free-falling void. The collapse occurred because the fundamental assumption of liquidity vanished. Without the belief that a buyer existed at the next price point, the entire market effectively ceased to function. The financial disease quickly mutated. It escaped the confines of Lower Manhattan and began infecting everyday citizens, including millions who had never invested a single dollar in the stock market. The vector for this contagion was fractional reserve banking. When you deposit money into a bank, it doesn't sit in a vault. The bank lends out the vast majority of your money to other borrowers, keeping only a tiny fraction on hand in physical reserves. This creates a cold mathematical trap. If the public's fear outweighs the physical cash a bank holds, it cannot survive a mass withdrawal. If everyone asks for their money at the exact same time, the cash simply is not there. This triggered a massive domino effect. When one bank failed to produce cash, rumors spread instantly. Panic swept to the next town, causing perfectly healthy, solvent institutions to be drained completely dry in a matter of hours. You can see the grim reality of this abstract math on the streets. Look at the sheer desperation of the crowd crushing against the doors of the American Union Bank in New York. People swarmed branches, frantic to salvage their financial lives. The desperation was cold and enduring. These citizens stood in freezing lines through the night, silently hoping the institution wouldn't fail before they reached the teller window to withdraw a fraction of their own savings. The American banking system collapsed under the weight of a sudden, mass withdrawal of public confidence. Collective panic transformed a localized market wipeout into a nationwide tragedy. The aftermath left the American working class shattered. Men who had spent years building careers in accounting and manufacturing were stripped of their dignity, forced to wear sandwich boards and beg for any available employment in a completely dead economy. The scale of poverty was absolute. Middle-class families lost their homes to foreclosure and were pushed into sprawling, makeshift shantytowns called Hoovervilles. These camps of scrap metal and wood sat directly in the shadow of the very skyscrapers built during the boom. The financial shock rippled across the Atlantic, fueled by the complex web of post-World War I debt. As American credit froze, the capital flows that sustained European reconstruction evaporated, dragging foreign banks into the abyss. With unemployment in industrial nations reaching 30%, public trust in democratic institutions began to evaporate. Governments failed to provide basic relief for the millions of starving citizens, leaving a vacuum filled by paramilitary factions and the promise of radical authoritarian solutions. Today, the mechanical ticker tape has been replaced by massive server farms. We trade in hyper-complex, massively leveraged digital markets that process billions of transactions at the speed of light. The speed has changed, but human psychology has not. With modern algorithms reacting in milliseconds rather than hours, we have to ask, have we cured the disease of financial panic, or have we simply engineered a much faster Black Tuesday?